Friends, today's NRISamay program from Los Angeles brought to you commercial-free by listeners like you. Your generous donations make possible for us to stay commercial-free, and today's show is pre-recorded. If you have a question for the guest, please send an email to nrisamay@gmail.com. We will follow up with the guest and find the answer for you. Thank you for your support.
Hello, friends. Welcome to NRISamay. This is your host, Vamsi Ala. It's June 7th, about 10:30 a.m. On today's show, we have Alison Peck. She's an agricultural law professor at West Virginia University, U.S., and her areas include sustainable development, environmental, and trade law. Welcome to the show, Alison. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I came across your story on GMO and its history on West Virginia University magazine that I get. So I want to start off with that question. In human history, what was there a need for GMO food?
A lot of things that go into this, but really the advent of GMO food had to do with, the ability. It was really, in some ways, an advance on what scientists had been doing for a long time, which was trying to fiddle with the seed and to make it more productive. And so around the 1980s, they started to develop techniques to be able to directly modify the DNA in a lab rather than doing it through conventional breeding in a way that allowed them to make some big steps forward in creating the types of improvements that they were looking for, that farmers were looking for, really, in order to make their seed more productive. So the goal was really not to benefit the consumer of food initially. It was really to benefit farmers primarily, who were looking for more productive seed, or seed that could withstand difficult conditions in the field, such as drought or pests or that sort of thing. So, obviously, to the extent that this helps farmers to be able to overcome blights, that has benefits for consumers of food as well, potentially.
I can think of it as an extension of hybrid varieties. Long ago, before GMO became a norm, people were tinkering with hybrid varieties where they were supposed to be more proactive, or they were supposed to be more resistant to pests, etc. And this is a natural extension where science and scientists came into, and then eventually corporates came into to solve the problem. Is that right?
Yes, that's how I would put it.
Problems of it is that we went to an extent where we are really seeing the growth too fast, and then we are not able to anticipate the consequences or the impacts of it to the environment and to humans. So is this a failure of regulation? So if at all there was regulation, what was the history of GMO regulation in U.S. and around the world? Can you explain it a little bit for us, please?
Yes, in my view, there is a failure of regulation of GMOs and has been since the beginning. So I don't see this as a scientific failure. I think that this technology, like many technologies, has potential if utilized properly. But I agree with you that the technology has gotten out in front of the regulation, and that was not entirely an accident. In the 1980s, the United States was one of the leaders in developing this technology. There were others as well, other countries as well that had a burgeoning industry. And the United States government was interested in promoting this U.S. industry and in getting these products to market in a relatively quick way, and did not want a lot of regulation. That was also during the Reagan administration in this country, where there was an attitude that favored less regulation. So you take that general climate, the general political and regulatory climate, and combine it with an industry that had a lot of potential to be a world leader, and many people who believe very strongly in the value of the product that they were promoting. And the result was a debate that lasted really a relatively short period, maybe about less than 10 years, where the legislature in this country was considering a sort of comprehensive regulation of products of genetic modification, defined as such, not not for the specific product by product, but based on the fact that they had been created using genetic modification. And the Reagan administration and the agencies that they directed took a different view and felt that the fact that the products had been genetically modified was not important, was not material, and all that should be looked at from a regulatory perspective was the features of the individual product itself. And so based on that view, they said, we don't need new regulation. We can continue to regulate these products just like we have regulated hybrids and any other kind of new plant or food produced using those new plants or potentially animals. And what they determined was that they would set up a three-agency structure. So there are three regulatory bodies that have jurisdiction over genetic modification in the U.S. They are the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or USDA, the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, and the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA. So USDA has jurisdiction at the front end when a seed has been developed and the developer would like to test, plant, and commercialize that product. So there are, at this point, at least as long as the seed falls under the jurisdiction of USDA, USDA has regulatory authority to monitor field testing, to conduct environmental analysis of the crop based on those field tests, and to approve or disapprove the crop for commercialization. The basis for that jurisdiction is a statute called the Plant Protection Act, and under that statute, USDA has authority to regulate plant pests. So that includes viruses and bacteria. And that was the hook for regulating genetically modified products because, of course, in the beginning they were using viral vectors to insert the DNA into the new plant.
Then what do FDA and EPA come into picture? What role do they play in regulating GMOs?
Yes. EPA comes into play primarily where a plant is itself pesticide resistant, such as the BT cotton. They have authority to regulate the pesticidal properties of that plant under a statute that gives them authority to regulate pesticides generally. It's called FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. So their authority, even though they are the environmental regulatory agency generally in this country, their authority is for the most part focused on the pesticidal properties of certain plants like the BT plants. The general environmental impacts are, in fact, not studied by EPA. They're really studied by the USDA when they make the decision to approve, or as they say, deregulate these products. They're required under U.S. law before any federal government agency is allowed to make a major decision that has a significant impact on the human environment. They're required to study the environmental effects that decision will have. That is the statute that then requires USDA to make this study before they deregulate the plants. But that statute it's not normative. It just requires them to do the study, report the findings, and report different alternatives that they might take. It does not require them to act in any particular way to approve or disapprove the petition for deregulation based on what they have found.
In my mind, when you have three bodies regulating this, there are a couple concerns. Right? There could be an overlap where each one of these huge governmental bodies are claiming that this is what we should regulate and not you, so causing a gridlock and potentially cases in federal courts. And second, the other side of that is there potentially could be gaps that neither of these three bodies are covering.
I think the latter has been the bigger issue, not the former. Because the body's authority is fairly distinct, there have not been a lot of conflicts about who is to regulate what. USDA regulates the field trials and the deregulation. EPA regulates any pesticidal properties. And we didn't discuss FDA, but they come into play when there is a food product that is created using a genetically modified product. So the areas of authority are pretty well defined, and there's really been little or no conflict about that. But I think that where we are starting to see problems is in the latter issue that you mentioned, the gaps. There have been potential gaps from the beginning. For example, the fact that EPA doesn't really study the environmental effects as a whole. It doesn't study whether there is crossbreeding with wild relatives, whether there are weeds that are developing herbicide resistance, those kinds of effects that people have been seeing over the lifetime, the last generation of these products. We have a gap. We have a gap there because the environmental analysis is really just done by the USDA in this process of approving or disapproving the deregulation. But there are potentially growing gaps. Another gap that has existed from the beginning is in FDA's authority, because there was a decision made from the beginning that FDA would review these under its authority to regulate food additives. So, anything that a manufacturer adds to a food that is intended to, affect the composition of the food. However, under food additive review, there has always been a sort of exemption for any kind of substance that is what they call generally recognized as safe, or they say GRAS. GRAS, to abbreviate that. And so that is any substance that can be demonstrated by the developer to have a general acceptance by the scientific community as safe. Well, in the past, that has had to be shown on a sort of substance-by-substance basis. But when this FDA authority was established in the early 1990s, FDA made the decision that genetic modification per se was going to be treated as GRAS, or generally recognized as safe. So that means that these products, even though they are subject to food additive review, they're only subject to, they're effectively not subject to any kind of testing or screening by USDA. The developers can say, see, this product is GRAS, and so unless there is some other aspect of the food that, like a known allergen or something that's being added to the food, there is no mandatory testing by FDA. The developers themselves can voluntarily submit studies, but of course those studies are done by the company, and they're reviewed but not retested by FDA.
Friends, NRISamay is a non-profit independent alternate media from Los Angeles, USA, which brings positive stories from grassroots activists from all corners of India and across the world. NRISamay does not rely on corporate funding, and our shows are commercial-free. We only rely on your donations. Corporate-funded media is driven by the TRP rating, and profits are blurring the distinction between news and entertainment. Why do our news channels talk so much about cricket, movies, accidents, popular figures' personal lives, babies of heroines, gossips, etc., while they should be covering the struggles of people, inequality in our society, rural issues, and border security issues? Why did our media raise some corruption crusaders to the sky on one day and shut them off completely when graft charges were raised on those corporate sponsors? Media relies so much on the corporate funding and government blessings that they cannot report independently. NRISamay is different. We don't accept funds from any corporations, and hence our shows are commercial free. We completely rely on donations from you. Please consider donating to NRISamay, and please go to nrisamay.com and donate generously. This is the only way together that we can continue NRISamay. All donations are kept transparent on nrisamay.com. And if you have any questions, please write to nrisamay@gmail.com.
Can you give a couple examples of how corporates use gaps in this regulation? I think one example I can think is of the Scott Miracle-Gro's Kentucky bluegrass. And then there's also the CRISPR gene editing technology that provides a loophole to this corporate. So can you provide us with a couple examples?
Yes, that is where I see the gaps growing in particular.
Okay.
So the first example you mentioned, the Scott's Kentucky bluegrass case, that was a sort of a second generation, well, probably more than second, but sort of middle generation technology called biolistics that was used to modify the DNA in that plant. So they were still inserting DNA, but they weren't using a virus to do it. They were sort of shooting it into the cells using this gun. And so since they were no longer using a virus, there was no obvious jurisdiction under the Plant Protection Act that we discussed earlier that gave USDA jurisdiction over viruses. So USDA issued a letter, this was a few years ago now, telling Scotts that they did not believe they had regulatory authority over this product because it was created using biolistics. So now we've moved on to another generation of technology where we already have the Talon's technology, and now we're on the advent of many products being created using CRISPR technology. And so those technologies don't involve inserting DNA at all. They involve, those gene editing technologies where they can edit or delete genes directly. So now clearly you're not, inserting any kind of a virus. There have already been cases where USDA has informed developers that they do not believe they have authority. There was based on the type of technology used. There were 6 lines of rice developed using Talon's technology that USDA has already issued a letter to the scientist, the developer scientist, saying that they do not believe they have authority over that because Talon's technology doesn't give them the Plant Protection Act authority. And with CRISPR, that kind of genetic modification has the prospect to become cheaper and easier and something that can be done by any graduate student in any lab. And so we are likely to see many, many products coming out using CRISPR, and there's no reason to think that USDA would consider itself to have any authority to regulate field testing or commercialization of those products.
Are there any attempts either in the Senate or the House to reconsider this, or is it status quo and because they don't want to lose the competitive advantage that U.S. has over other nations?
Where it's being reconsidered is in the regulatory agencies under President Obama. So in the middle of 2015, President Obama created a task force among the 3 agencies, USDA, FDA, and EPA, to consider the new technology that's on the horizon, to look at what's called the coordinated framework, which is the framework that sets out the regulation for these 3 agencies, and to consider whether adaptations to the coordinated framework are needed. So that process is underway. The National Academy of Sciences was commissioned to provide the report on where technology is going, and that preliminary report on that is being released this week. So there is some attempt to refine the coordinated framework to attempt to plug these gaps and to have a process for being aware of where technology is going. Whether it's sufficient, whether it will be sufficient to try to adapt the coordinated framework using existing statutes that really did not anticipate biotechnology is another question, and one that's going to need to be studied. And if in my opinion, it may be very difficult to continue to use existing authority to capture all the concerns and risks that are raised by even the current generation of products, let alone to be able to adapt to future ones. And so that to my mind, does suggest a role for the legislature to look at this and to consider a more comprehensive solution. But so far, that has not happened.
When President Obama set up this body, is it to provide a comprehensive solution that goes as a bill in front of the Senate, or is it because of the gridlock that we have, is it expected to go through executive actions and orders? What's your sense right now?
I think it's very likely that what they will do is to try to alter the coordinated framework within the statutory authority that they already have. And that's partly because of the difficulty in getting anything done in Congress right now, I'm sure. But there's a long history of not preferring a legislative solution to this. And that has a lot to do with opposition within the industry to treating genetic modification, the process, as something that is special and deserves to be regulated. There has, since the 1980s, been a real resistance to that view.
The corporate lobbyists is where it's being stymied by. I'm assuming that the general population is in favor of having a comprehensive solution, right? Or is it not?
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite understand your question. Could you repeat it?
The stymieing of the history of not providing a comprehensive solution in the Senate is from the efforts of the lobbying groups in Washington, D.C.?
Yes. Well, I don't know that it's lobbyists per se. I think the lobbyists are delivering the message of the industry.
Okay. Right.
I think that it has long been the perception of the industry, supported by some scientists, although not all scientists, that genetic modification is nothing new, nothing special. It's merely an advance in plant breeding, and it should not be regulated per se. But that is definitely an industry view. As to whether there's a view, I think you were asking about whether the general population agrees with that.
Yes.
I think it's very difficult to answer that question because I think that and this is something that I've written about extensively, I think the fact that we developed a regulatory instead of a legislative solution in the beginning meant that the stakes were relatively low once the rules had been written, which happened very early on in the process. And so most of the general public doesn't know much about genetic modification, genetically modified seeds or foods used creating them. Even in very recent studies, there's a professor at Rutgers who's studied this question of public perceptions over the course of the history of these products, and even in very recent surveys, the ignorance of genetic modification is still extremely high. Most members of the general public don't believe that they have ever eaten a food, a genetically modified food, and of course that's not correct.
How do you see Europe and Asia, and especially India, being different in this regulation front?
Well, Europe has always been much more precautionary in its approach to GMOs, and so they have a more thorough regulatory and review structure. And India has been very resistant to GMOs throughout its history, and there have with some I think some effects that have probably both pros and cons to India. There is now some movement under the new Prime Minister to work with states that are open to approving plantings. So because the states have effectively a veto on whether to approve transgenic crop field trials, the result has basically been a moratorium, and so that means that Indian companies who are developing new varieties have not been able to conduct those field tests that would allow them to get approved and then to bring those products to market both in India and elsewhere. That's starting to change because certain states that are sort of more friendly to Prime Minister Modi have begun to approve some field trials. So I think there are maybe 8 states or something that have approved some field trials. Now I say that this history has some pros and cons. To explain that, I think that there are definitely some risks to genetically modified foods, and some that are particular to India. I think that anything that has wild native cousins, any plant that has native cousins in the natural environment, is particularly risky, because there is the possibility of outcompeting or invading those native strains, and potentially eliminating or decimating those strains. And so I think that is less of a problem in the United States, because we don't have native strains of the commercialized crops, but India does in a few cases. So that is a concern there, and a reason, I think, to proceed with special caution. I think we can get into this a bit more later, but I think that smaller farmers may benefit less in many cases, especially those that are not using irrigation may benefit less, or may not benefit at all from these products, and it could put them could create socioeconomic problems for those farmers. But the flip side of this, and the potential difficulty with the resistance to GM field trials in India, is that getting back to the question about food and population, and whether these crops are needed. One thing that I sometimes find frustrating is that proponents of genetically modified seed and food in the United States will often cite the potential life-saving benefits, and the potential to feed the world essentially through these products. And in theory, that is a great potential benefit of these products. But the problem is that the market does not really incentivize the creation of products that would be most beneficial to small farmers working in developing countries who are the most at risk of famine due to blight or weather conditions. So those farmers aren't spending lots and lots of money on seed. They mostly save their seed. They often can't afford to spend money on seed technology. So those are the farmers who most need the technology, most need advances in crop breeding that could be really benefited by genetic modification, and they're also the least likely to receive it, because there's just not a way for companies to recover the R&D. So the things like genetically modified wheat and corn and soybean and canola seed are not particularly helping small farmers in developing countries that are most at risk. So if there were enough political will on the part of the Indian government, and in cooperation with the U.S. government, with the European Union, others who are committed to reducing hunger, it would be possible, number one, for countries anywhere to develop government-funded, publicly funded solutions that would encourage R&D on the products that could be most helpful to the most vulnerable farmers and populations. And, barring that, I think that India and countries like India are most likely to have the science and industry that's going to take the lead on those kinds of products, because they're most intimately familiar with the challenges. So I think that there is some. There are a lot of pros and cons with India and other rapidly developing countries being resistant to granting field trials.
Friends, if you liked today's show, please go to youtube.com/NRISamay and click on the subscribe button. You will get notified every time we publish a new show. And you can also like us on our social media sites like Facebook, Twitter, and Google+.